Hello everyone, my name is Zhang. I'm currently a postdoc at University of Montreal. Today I would like to introduce you our recent project on brain decoding using deep graph convolutional neural networks. Here is the outline of the talk today. In this talk, I will introduce you what is brain decoding and how can we apply graph convolution for it. And we will specifically test on the task ephemeral data from the Human Connectome project. And now let's dig in. So brain decoding has been one of the classical topics in neuroscience research, with the aim of inferring a brain state from a short scans of brain imaging. There is many different available modalities that we can use here. We specifically focus on the task ephemeral data. On the left, there is an example of how brain decoding works. So in the scanner, the participant will visualizing different types of the images, for instance, the human faces or different kinds of the tools. And the brain activity from the visual cortex will be recorded and will be used to train a classifier that could differentiate different types of the image just based on their brain activities. Nowadays, this field has been greatly expanded, especially what kind of stimuli we can use and what kind of the task we can actually decode. For instance, here there is an example that we can use ephemeral data to actually reconstruct each frames of the movie that the participant was watching during scanning. However, most of the previous studies on brain decoding are actually focused on a very small groups of participants, usually like from 7 subjects to 10 subjects. But there is a very important question to the problem is how can we generalize this model to a much larger population? If we want to use these tools in real application cases. So here we aim to actually build a decoding model that could apply to large-scale brain imaging dataset. So in order to ensure the good generalizability, here we didn't use the linear models as proposed before. Instead, we're using the deep neural networks to learn more complex and nonlinear models. So here is the data set that we can use. We're specifically using the task ephemeral data from the Human Connectome project that was currently public available, which includes 1,200 healthy subjects that has been scanned under over 20 different conditions. And we aim to directly decode all the 20 conditions at the same time. So the decoding pipeline is showing here. It was already introduced in our previous paper. So the input of the pipeline is you have a fixed brain graph, and also you project the 4D ephemeral data onto the brain graphs. Will give you a 2D time series matrix. And then you just put them going through the GCM model, and then they will give you the predicted task state. So in our previous paper, we have already shown, like by even using a simple first-order GCM implementation, the model can actually annotate 10 seconds of ephemeral data with very high accuracy, almost 19%. And also we show what is exactly the feature that was learned by these graph convolutions. And here we show actually during the training process, the different types of body movement here as example, it was gradually separated and from each other and showing very high clustering effect. So in this study, we're actually approaching different method for graph convolution. It's called ChebNet. The ChebNet was actually using the Chebyshev binomial expansions to approximate the graph convolution itself. And what's nice about the ChebNet is by controlling different order of decay, it actually could show you different effect by propagating information on the graphs. For instance, when k equals 1, that was used in the first order DCM, that only the information from direct neighbors are considered. But when k is larger in more high order neighbors, high order neighbors will be included, and a more complex representation of the brain dynamics could be learned. So here the example of that is, if we are using 5 order ChebNet on the functional graph, our decoding accuracy could actually increase until 93% of accuracy. That was on the 21 conditions. And if we summarize this decoding accuracy according to the cognitive domain, we can see all the cognitive domains, they're above 95%. And next, we specifically looking at what kind of factors that could influence this decoding model. Of course, we have the k orders, and also how you define the brain graphs. So here is an example of the functional graph that was calculated based on the resting state functional connectivity for the same group of the subjects. And also the spatial graph that was calculated based on how the two regions, they were adjacent to each other in the brain anatomy. So in here, well, the results show that by choosing different k order, or by choosing different neighbor size in the graph, the accuracy could be significantly improved. And also for functional graph, is more sensitive to the choice of for functional graph, doesn't seem that sensitive to the choice of the k. By anything that above 1 is will give you similar performance. But for the spatial graph, we see more direct, like 2 group effect. Like you have to choose a k order like 5 and above. And so next is we try to interpret these results. Why do we need high k orders, and why do we need different brain graphs? So first we look at the summary results here on the right, that was summarized the decoding accuracy according to different cognitive domains. So from here we can see it also showed a domain effect. For instance, for the motor task, there is no effect of the k orders, but for the working memory task, the k effect was more significant. Which actually makes sense, because we know in neuroscience research there has already been reported that the body movement are specifically and highly functional localized in the sensory motor cortex. But for the visual working memory, it actually involves multiple different brain systems, including the visual cortex, attention networks, and the frontal parietal networks. So we will see more of that effect in the following analysis. So first, for the motor task, as expected, we see we use a technique called CKA to study the similarity of the representations at each layer. So which was actually will be showing you what kind of new information or new feature that was learned at each layer. So and the optimal structure would be like a Z-blocked structure like this. Like, so it means at each layer you will maintain some of the older information from the previous layer, but you also will learn some new information. And so from the example of the motor task, we can see using the first order key, first order DCM or first order of the ChebNet is already give you the optimal choice. And if we're required, if we want to use a high order model, a lot of like duplicated representation will be learned in the model. On the other hand, for the working memory task, we see that the first order model is not enough, because there is a lot of like important information was missing. But when you have a 5-order ChebNet model, you will learn more complex representations based on the neurodynamics. A second tool that we used is by directly projecting the learned representations from the DCM model. So here we try to project the representations onto a 2D space by using different kinds of tools, including TSNE. So comparing to so by directly comparing the visualization results, we see that that when you're using GCN, all like different categories of the data are highly separated from each other and showing a very high clustering effect. But the raw data, all the types of the data were highly overlapped from each other, and also there is a high mixing effect. And when you try to choose a different graph, for instance, the spatial graph that has a very high local effect, some of the mixing effect will show in the representations. And here we show you like how the representation changed during the model training, and specifically after. Here we can see like after probably like 20 apples, the model already reaching the plateau, like around the 19% of accuracy. And by then, the representation is highly separated for different types of body movements. And we did the same analysis for the working memory task. So again, for the GCN representations, we see like even for the complex task as visual working memory, which involves like 2 levels of the cognitive processing, including object recognition of 4 types of the images, and also different memory load, 0 back and 2 back. And so for such complex cognitive task, the GCN model still can highly separate the different types of working memory conditions. And comparing to that, if you just using a spatial graph or local graph, they are going to show a lot much severe mixing effect that might impact your decoding performance. And again, we also show how the data was distributed like during the training process. So here we have basically the same conclusion. After 20 apples, the model reaching to its plateau, and the data already data distribution already highly separated for each condition. And there is more of the condition that we could explore. So here first is how we calculated the brain connectivity, because that was the key fundamental thing in the brain graphs. So here we actually explore like 4 different types of the types of the brain graphs, including the spatial graph and functional graph, as we already explained before. And also for the anatomical graph, we're actually using the diffusion tracker graph from the same group of people, and the structural graph using the structural covariance of the cortical thickness. And also when we check their network architecture by plotting the network architecture, we could see the spatial graph has a very high local effect. And when we're using the anatomical graph, there start to show some modular structure. And in functional graph, the long distance connections and interhemisphere connections are showing more and more. And in the final structural graph, it seems there is a lot of like randomness was introduced in the model, in the graph. By looking at the model performance, we can see a very similar pattern with that. That is, the highest performance was actually achieved by the functional graph, followed by the diffusion graph or anatomical graph, and then the spatial graph. And the lowest performance was performed by the structural graph. The structural graph, that is because of the randomness that was introduced in the graph. So because we observe this randomness, then we are specifically looking at how randomness could affect this, our model. So we start from the functional graph and try to randomly swap the edges within the graph, but still maintain the no degree distribution. So here we can see when almost like half of the edges has been changed, there is no clear structure inside of the graph. But the performance of the model doesn't seem that bad, and especially like when the ratio of the edge switch was not that high, for example, like 10% or 20%, there is still very high decoding accuracy. I think this is a very interesting and important experiment because it actually showed that this pipeline or this decoding model was not that sensitive to the graph that we constructed, which means like the graph that we built on one group of the data can be transferred or be used in a different population or different groups and even different size. And another factor that is important for brain graphs is how you define the nodes. So here we explore like 3 different brain atlases, including the brain atom atlas that was built based on the diffusion tractography, the functional graph, the Yos atlas based on the resting state of memor, and Glasser's atlas that integrate multimodal information. And the experiments actually show that the modality of the data that you use to generate the atlas doesn't really matter, and what actually matters is the scale of the atlas, which is how many nodes you have for the graph. And the optimal choice would be at least 300 regions. So a quick summary of the talk today. We try to introduce you like the GCM is a very powerful tool to analyze the brain imaging data. And in here, we specifically focus on the ChebNet implementation of the the graph convolution. And there is many factors that could impact the performance. With the optimal choice as you use 5 order of neighbors based on the functional graph, and you need to at least have 300 regions. That's all of the talk today. I would like thank all the great team members in